Hello, Mr. Howard.
What's up, guys? Mr. Wayne.
All right, so this is gonna be episode number 4, and in the previous one, we actually covered a lot of pre-flop play. So we give you some strategies about what to do pre-flop. And this episode, instead of going to the turn, we decided to go to the river first. And the reason for that is that it is a lot easier to understand the turn once you understand the river. If you understand the turn based on understanding the flop, it doesn't actually flow very nicely this way. So we decided to skip to go to the river first because we think it would be maximum value for you. So there are two main topics that we would like to cover for this week. The first is polarization, and the second is bluff catching. So it really ties pretty well together because when you reach the river, you often have one of two main categories. Or you can see you have three categories. One is when you have very weak hand, which is a bluff. The second is a very strong hand, so a value hand. And the third is a bluff catcher. But the first two, the bluffs and the value hand, they tie together. And we don't want to think of these things as like completely separate because often when we have our value hands, it's an opportunity for us to increase the EV of our game tree by also bluffing in that spot. So we'll use this opportunity to explain to you a little bit deeper about polarization. So what does polarization actually mean? The first part of polarization actually means that um, you're either bluffing or you have a very strong value hand. So there is a very pure polarization. So the pure polarization is when you have nuts or nothing, basically. In practical poker, in actual real life poker, it isn't always a spot of nuts and nothing, but you can be quite close to the nuts and nothing spot. So often, maybe you have the top 5 nuts. Like if the flush completes, then sometimes, like quite often, the flush is a value hand and everything else is like a bluff catcher or a bluff. So when we reach this spot, we tend to want to be betting with our flushes as value, and then we want to add in some bluffs because that increases our EV. And then for the rest of the hands, we just kind of play it as a bluff catcher. Of course, there's the in position aspect and out of position aspect. So I guess the easiest one to cover, and we'll cover that first, is when we are in position. So when we're in position, we have very clear information about what the other guy has done. If the other guy has checked, especially, we can decide whether we are gonna be um, betting or we are gonna be checking. When we have the portion that is the bluff catcher, we are always gonna be checking because there just isn't any value in betting the bluff catcher. And then for the rest of our range, we will bet. Um, yeah, I'll just pause here for you to add some things in.
Just one thing I would add there about being the in position player when you have a chance to polarize. The thing that really determines whether or not you're going to bet a hand for value is whether or not you can expect to have 50% equity when called or more. Now, there's some exceptions to that. Like sometimes if the opponent can make a raise and steal some EV back from you by raising, you're going to want a little bit more than 50% equity. But as a general rule of thumb, you're looking to bet hands for value that when your opponent calls, you win more than half the time. And I think that should be pretty intuitive because even if you don't know a lot about how EV is generated, you can kind of sense that when you make a bet on the river, if you're going to win more than half of the time when your opponent sticks money in, that's a good thing for you. That means that you're coming out on top of that equation. That means you're actually getting a win off of your bet, a net win. So out of position things change a little bit. You can argue that you can bet for a little bit thinner. You can make bets that don't quite have 50% equity, and that's just a positional thing. Because if you check, the hand's not over out of position. The opponent can bet behind you, and that puts you at a disadvantage. But I like looking at the end position as a general way to introduce this because that idea that we want to be betting for value with hands that can get called and win more than half the time is a pretty good starting point. So why don't you talk a little bit about in a model where we don't necessarily have to have the nuts, but we want to be good greater than 50% of the time when called. How do we go about designing that range? I don't want to get too much into like the theory side of this, but if for instance, you thought your opponent was going to fold too much, what would be the first thing that you would do with your polarized range to try to maximize your profits versus him?
Well, but before I go into that, I think that I will personally, I would actually not be going for 50% of like when we get caught 50% of the time we win, because if we get caught 50% of the time and we win, right, we are kind of breaking even with our bets. So I would actually move the number slightly higher than 50%, because like a lot of the very close break even spots, those kind of get negated when our opponent can raise us sometimes, and
Right.
maybe we
So if
like
all the money was in, it would be 50 minimum. That would be the break even. And then if there's money left behind after we bet, we're going to want more than 50.
Yeah. So in general, I think we move the line a little bit and just go for something like 60 or 70%, just to I think it's better to have an easily executable strategy that you need to be less precise on than have a very good strategy that is hard to be precise on. Because if
Sure.
we go for percent, we have to be very, very precise. Because if we are off the precision on one way, we lose a lot of
And that's a really
EV.
good point too, that like, this is a conversation I just had with some of my players recently, where if you try to be too exact before you have a really good understanding of what the opponent's range actually looks like, you run the risk of massively complicating in a direction that doesn't actually offer you more accuracy. It'd be nice to be able to say, oh, I need exactly 52% equity in this spot. But if you can't visualize the opponent's range properly or really know how the opponent's going to respond, that's really not a useful rule of thumb for you to operate from. So I like this idea of, let's pick a threshold that makes it way easier for us to see if we have a hand that can really get some solid value.
Mm.
And that makes it easier too for a player who's just really not all that familiar yet with being able to visualize the strength of ranges. You see this happen quite a bit in real games, where probably some of the bigger leaks of the newer players is they aren't value betting thin enough, but you can't expect them to value thin enough yet if they haven't looked at a lot of grids and studied the opponent's range. So I think it is better to just work with something like 60, maybe even closer to 70, because that's something that they're going to be able to feel and spot pretty regularly, and not have to worry about missing it.
Yeah. So in order to proceed from here, I think we can try to tie in some examples first, and then we use the examples to explain a bit of concepts. So let's say we just create a bot now. Let's say the bot is king high. I'll just make it first we go with a dry king high bot, which is pretty kind of easier to play, so to speak. Let's say the bot is king 9, deuce, 5, and then 7. There's no flush. It's pretty much, it's very unlikely any player has a straight. And what happens is that, so right now me and Nick are in a hand. Nick, I raise pre-flop and Nick calls in the big blind. I raise from the cutoff. So from our previous episodes, I'm playing about 20% from the cutoff. Nick calls. I'm not sure how many percent he's playing, but let's operate in a vacuum, because once we operate in a vacuum, then we can tell you how to make adjustments for loose players, tight players, and different sorts of players. So now the hand goes, Nick checks, I bet, he calls. Nick checks, I bet, he calls. River, he checks. And it's my decision now. So I've bet 2 streets on a king 9 deuce 5 7 board with no flush, no possible flush draws on earlier streets. So what's going on in my head at this point of time is probably I'm thinking, for my value bets, how often is Nick actually going to be calling me with worse? What's the weakest hand he's gonna call in this situation? And in a vacuum, I think that a relatively reasonable calling range for Nick would be something like a king here, top pair.
I would agree with that. And that gives you some insight into what you want the bottom of your value range to be. So if the worst hand that I would be calling is some sort of weak top pair, then maybe a rough guideline for the worst hand Wayne would want to value bet is something like a strong top pair.
Yeah, it would have to be like a pretty okay. Like if Nick is calling, and we also think about his get to river range, right? Some of his two pairs, some of his sets may not actually get to the river with this particular line because he might be raising it on the earlier street on the flop or on the turn, at least with some percentage of the time. So when it comes to the river, a lot of his range is weighted towards something like, maybe he doesn't even have ace king pre-flop because he might be three betting that. So we think about like, what can he actually get to the river with? And it looks something like king queen, maybe king jack, king 10, and then some like king 8, king 6, king 4, king 3, which is not that many different hands that he's actually going to call me. Because he also has a lot of hands that catch up by the river. Maybe he rivers the two pair. And I think in this spot, it's hard for me to bet anything. You see, he has maybe about 6 or 7 different hands that I named that he could call with on the river. And in order to be 60 or 70% ahead of him, I have to be stronger than 60 or 70% of those hands that will call. So if we take 2/3 of that, it'll probably be king, queen, king. I have to be stronger than king, jack at least. So probably
I would say it's probably much closer to ace king if you want to have 60 to be safe. I would probably say like ace king plus.
Yeah, I think king queen is fine because it's just not so common that you show up with a hand better than king queen. But yeah, I mean ace king queen, it's somewhere about there, I guess.
Agreed. So walk us through what happens now. Once you identify the worst hand that you want to bet, how does that help you figure out how to operate on the river overall? So now you know that you can get value from, say, king, queen, or better. You're definitely going to bet that hand now because you know that the amount of times that you get called leaves you with a net profit relative to checking back, which is what you want. It's basically what you're trying to achieve when you polarize. Now, talk to us about the other side of your range because it's very clear now you're going to value bet king, queen plus. How are you going to decide what you're going to bluff?
Well,
maybe not the specific hands that you're bluffing, but what would cause you to be very interested in bluffing a lot?
Well, this question is a little bit tricky to answer because how I would think about how often I would bluff in this situation is actually based on how often I think my opponent has a folding hand. So from a very exploitative standpoint, and I think this is better, especially at the newer for newer players, to think about like I mean, since I'm value betting here, I have the opportunity to add some bluffs in. So naturally, the first bluffs that I add in would be hands that are at the bottom of my range here. So basically, hands that have no showdown value. So for example, if I had a hand like let's say 7-8, and I decided to bet the flop, and then the turn comes a 5, I pick up a gut shot, I bet again. River, I hit a pair. I probably don't bluff with this hand because I have showdown value. On the other hand, if I had a hand that has absolute no showdown value, I'll be pretty interested to bluff with this hand because I know that I have a polarized strategy here. I have enough strong hands that I can infuse some bluffs in, and then I start adding this in. But what's also important to consider is whether our opponent actually has a hand here that he pulls or not. And how do we know this? We have to make some assumptions and some guesses. There are people that like to call the flop and the turn with any pair and then fold the river quite a lot. There are also people that just simply don't want to fold the river when they have a pair. So I would think about these things before I actually consider making the bluff.
So versus somebody who you expected to fold too much, that's the type of spot where you're just going to unleash with bluffs on the river, correct?
Yeah, and the first bluff I would unleash are hands with no pair, basically.
I think that's an important point, and we need to touch on it. When you're polarizing a river range, you're trying to do two things. You're using a portion of your range that's trying to get value. That's the king, queen plus. And then you're using a portion of your range that's basically trying to force or threaten the dead pot. You're trying to steal the dead pot with the bluffs in your range. And because you're only allowed to use a certain amount of bluffs before you're bluffing too much, you're going to start with bluffs that have very, very little equity, like bluffs that aren't pairs. The reason that Wayne's 8-7 would check back on the river is because it just made a pair, and now it can check back, and it's entitled to a portion of the pot because it has equity. That hand doesn't have much functionality to be betting as a bluff. You'd rather use a hand that had very, very little equity because you don't need to bluff, as you're not required to bluff with a hand that has showdown value. It's not as useful, I guess would be a good way to put it, which is why we would check the 8-7 back and we would bluff something that doesn't have pair value. That is a harder strategy for me to play against than if Wayne starts bluffing hands that have showdown value. So he's basically trying to pick the best polarization strategy possible. And that would require him to lean towards using bluffs that have very, very little equity.
Yeah, so I'm just kind of like, I don't know if this can be seen. I'm writing on a piece of paper where you can see this. So like basically at the top part is the value range, and let's say king queen falls at right at the bottom of our value range. That's kind of how I would want it to be pictured. And then
Nice.
when we start including our bluffs, right, we have no reason to add hands that are at this point. So the hand like king, if we decided that say king queen is the weakest hand, we can value bet. We don't want to be bluffing with king three because king three has enough showdown value, and the higher you are here, the more showdown value you will have, and therefore when you check, you actually have higher expected value. On the other hand, the bluffs, when you have a very, very weak hand right at the bottom of the range, these hands, when you check, you almost always lose. So if you could choose one hand to start bluffing with, you would naturally include the hand right at the bottom first instead of hands that are higher part of the bluff catching range.
I feel like that should be intuitive too. Most new players, I think, understand that concept, at least on the river, and that's why I'm glad we're starting with the river before we go back to the turn, because it's easier to see why we shouldn't bet with a medium strength hand when it's the last street. You can check with that medium strength hand, and you're going to win a certain portion of the pot. You can check with that really weak bluff, and you never win a portion of the pot. So being able to visualize that, I think, really helps a player to understand why he should be constructing his polarized range in a polarized way.
Yeah. So since we are talking about in position, I think we can wrap up with kind of what happens like if we're in position, right? Right now we are the addresser. What happens if we are not the addresser? And let's say it's the same spot, but the positions are like nick bets, I call, nick bets, I call, and nick bets again. Um, so
So
now, if, go
sorry,
ahead.
go ahead, and then I'll jump in. I was going to say we could do it like that, or you could just visualize the same example we did. And from my perspective, what should I call? How should I figure out what I'm going to call? No matter which way you want to visualize it, just think of an example where you're facing bets now, as opposed to being the one doing the betting. The difference is you now have the range that consists of mostly medium strength hands, and your opponent is playing the range that has really good value and bluffs. So the decision that we need to make here is what type of hands are we going to call, and how much are we going to call? Go for it, Wayne.
Yeah. So basically, how I would think about these spots is that in the first place, we need to kind of map it out back to pre-flop and think of how wide we are playing and how wide our opponent is playing, because it's I just want to point this out to make it clear. Like if it's button versus big blind versus it's a under the gun spot versus big blind, it makes quite a big difference because the ranges gets much narrower because both ranges are stronger. But what happens along the way on every street is that we start with a bigger portion of our range, and then because not all parts of the range continue, so it becomes smaller and it becomes smaller and it becomes smaller by the river. So now that we are at the river and the range is a little bit smaller, I would actually think about in a from a theoretical sense first, right? We have to think about how often do we need to call so that our opponent can't bluff us like all the time. So that's kind of we don't want to be we don't want to have a strategy that we are calling so little that our opponent can just start bluffing as often as like super often. So given that that's the case, we want to be defending some hands that are relatively on the stronger side of things. So getting infested by, sorry about that. My house. So what we want to be thinking about is what hands is strong enough to beat our opponents. So if let's say Nick is using a relatively normal kind of bet size, let's say he's betting 2/3 of the pot, and let's say for the rest of this discussion we are just using one sizing. It's kind of middle-ish sizing is pretty easy for us to work with. So I would think about whether my pot odds are good enough because whether I win Nick often enough, and if he's numbers kind of complicate the matter, so let's not use the numbers. But what I want to be doing is I need to win Nick at least. If it's 2/3 of a pot, it will end up being I need to win him maybe say like 40% of the time, or slightly less than that. If
So
he,
I think we could simplify that whole thing and just say pot odds are going to matter here when they're betting, and depending on the bet size they use, it's going to determine how much they're allowed to bluff. And if they're bluffing too much, Wayne's going to start calling way more aggressively with medium strength pairs. So this might be the only spot where I think it's relevant to sort of introduce theory. In theory, if I was playing perfectly, there is a optimal bluffing frequency that I would try to achieve that would make it very hard for Wayne to have a plus EV call. Now, Wayne is trying to basically stop me from abusing that frequency, because if Wayne starts folding too much, I just get to bluff everything. If Wayne starts calling too much, I stop bluffing altogether, and now he's paying my value at too high of a rate. So he's going to try, if he doesn't know what I'm doing, he's going to try to sort of play that frequency that keeps me from exploiting him. He's going to try to play a frequency that stops me from being able to print money with bluffs, but doesn't call too much that it would allow my value to just print way too much money. But if Wayne knew for some reason that I'm just too aggressive, which could happen, he's going to switch his strategy and start calling very aggressively with those hands. And then we would be able to say that Wayne is exploiting me because I'm bluffing too much and he's responding correctly by calling too much.
Yeah, so how I would really defend against Nick's strategy for the most part, assuming he's playing the strategy that we previously discussed, that he's betting with the weakest hand he's betting is King Queen, and then he's also bluffing sometimes. What I would do in this situation is realize that even though his weakest value hand is King Queen, I would need to be calling some hands weaker than King Queen because he has some bluffs. And if ideally, I want to be the simplest way is to kind of decide roughly what his worst value hand is, and then call around what his weakest value bet is. I think that's relatively stable of a strategy.
I think that's a decent heuristic, yeah, in terms of what we're going for here, where we want to give them a rough playable guideline that they'll be able to identify. So in this case, that would probably be a medium to strong top pair hand. That would be the bottom of Wayne's calling range. And that would be the strategy that he takes if he was just trying to play straightforward, not really knowing my bluffing frequencies exactly. Once he has more knowledge over my bluffing frequency, he can start to either expand or narrow that calling range. So if, again, he thought I was bluffing too much, now maybe he's just going to start calling more middle pair and weaker pairs. And if he thought I was not bluffing enough, now he can even fold maybe some strong top pairs. There we would say that when I'm not bluffing enough, Wayne doesn't have as much incentive to be bluff catching. Be a good way of putting it.
Yeah. Okay, just gonna draw something out to. So let's see, how do I do this? Like, I'm coming back to the picture again that I'm drawing, right? If Nick has a portion that so basically if Nick is the one that is playing this value and then he's betting king queen, he has bluff catcher and he has his bluff, right? He's polarized between here and here. Like, my strategy ends up being something like this, where I call a certain portion because it's good enough to beat some of his values, and I need to call slightly weaker than his values. But there's also a top portion that is like, if I have the nuts here, I'm gonna be raising for value. So it's not that, like, we need to think about it like every time facing a certain bet, like this whole thing, it kind of repeats itself and becomes smaller here. So in reality, it will end up being something like I have values here, super value, and then I have the opportunity to kind of balance with a little bit of bluffs as well with my raises.
Nice. I love that visual. I think it helps a ton. And you did a much better job than I could, because I couldn't draw that, especially in 20 seconds. But the thing that I think we could say to go along with your rule of thumb for the weakest hand we would call, maybe the easiest way to visualize this is try to see how it would never make sense for Wayne to be folding any hand that is better than my weakest value hand. So Wayne would never fold any hand better than king queen, because it beats some of my value. And the reason Wayne is calling some hands weaker than king queen is because he's trying to stop me from bluffing at a very exploitative rate. So very clear calls with hands that beat the bottom of my value range. And then he's also including some hands that are weaker, that never beat my value, but they exist in his calling range to prevent me from being able to make an adjustment where I just start bluffing like crazy and running him over. So that's the defensive strategy. That's sort of how it's constructed. And those are rules of thumb. But I think for what we're working with here, we gave a pretty stable heuristic for how to approach that spot from Wayne's shoes in that situation, which would be the bluff catching guy.
Yeah. One thing I want to add in, and I think we should touch on, is that we need to have very different strategies against very different players. And especially if you are relatively new to poker and the people that you are playing with are your friends, people that also are not professionals players. What happens a lot in these games is that the game plays a lot more passively than in a game that has a lot of pros. So when that's the case, quite often the value range at the top doesn't actually, like, a lot of people won't even bet their king queens and even their ace king here. They might only bet two pair or better. So if that happens, right, our strategy is to follow the heuristic that we mentioned, to also call based on what we think his weakest value hand is. So if I think Nick is only betting top two pair and better, so I can only call with top two pair and better. Maybe that's not a good example. If Nick bets with any two pair, then I can only call if I have two pair and better.
And the only thing that I would add to that, just as a slight clarification, is that would be Wayne's approach if he thought my bluffing frequencies were somewhat controlled or somewhat stable. Maybe the best mindset thing we could offer here, along the lines of really how important it is to know the type of player that you're up against, is this idea that those heuristics are great for when you don't really know how aggressive your opponent is being in terms of bluffing. But some of the most valuable information you can gain at the table is to know how much your opponent likes to bluff. Because the moment where Wayne knows that I had a few too many drinks last night and now I'm just a little bit aggressive today, that's when he can really change his strategy up and start bluff catching a lot more. And he can really start to punish me for being too wide in that sense. And then on the other end of it, if he knows that I'm just the type of guy who just doesn't like to bluff, he can also make some pretty big strategy adjustments in his favor by folding way more than he would against other players. So the heuristics that we gave are stable and good as a starting point for not knowing your opponent's bluffing frequencies. But just keep in mind that some of the most valuable edge that you potentially have is being able to sort of like look at your opponent and determine whether or not this is someone who likes to bluff a lot or not enough. Once you have, if you are able to identify that, it can give you some pretty big advantages, and it can make your strategy fairly easy. Because if I'm bluffing way too much against Wayne, he doesn't have too many hard decisions. He just is going to look down and say, well, if I have a pair, I'm probably going to call because Nick has too many hands that aren't pairs. So in a lot of ways, knowing the type of opponent you're up against can really make your bluff catching strategy a lot easier and a lot more winning at the same time, which is kind of a cool combination. I've always loved to find ways where I can simplify my strategy and make it more winning at the same time. And that's what that type of information would give you. If you know how much someone's bluffing, you can do quite a lot of damage to them.
Yeah, so to add on to that, I think another thing to touch on is that there are two situations where opponents can be bluffing a lot more or not bluffing enough. And the first is what Nick mentioned, where it's an aggressive player or a passive player. It's kind of the player profile, the player type. The second thing is the board. Sometimes and quite oftentimes there is certain board textures that are that both players just get to the river with slightly more weak hands, and so you can visualize this a little bit better. It'd be situations where maybe there were a lot of straight draws and a lot of flush draws and missed. So let's, like, if I give a board example, maybe a board like Queen 9 7, and then it's a 5. It's Queen 9 7 flush draw. It's a 4. It's a double flush draw, and the river comes a 4 or 2 that doesn't complete a flush. Like, there were many straight draws on the board. There were 2 flush draws on the board. And what happens in this river is because on the flop and turn, both players have a lot more equity with their draws, so they will continue, and oftentimes they get to the river. Or when the river completely breaks, both players are in a spot where they have a lot of bluff now. They have a lot of hands that have no pairs and a lot of weak hands. So it's very useful to think about how often our opponent has a bad hand first, because if for example, as compared to a different board where it goes like king deuce deuce, then it's a 7 and then it's a 5. It's not so many hands that will call twice and have a bluff on the river. So we need to be kind of thinking a lot about how often our get to river range has natural bluffs first, and then kind of stack that on top with how aggressive and how bluffy.
Nice, I like that. So in that case, Wayne's added another dimension to this bluff catching thing, which is it's not just about how aggressive the player is, it's also about how easy it is for that player to be bluffing too much on a specific board texture. So you're kind of coming at it from 2 different angles. And then like there's more too. Like that's the coolest thing. And we can build on this in the future episodes, but like I could add a third dimension, and then it could be the bet size that's being used. Like that could be a completely different part of it that you look at to determine if a player is bluffing too much. Oh, he's using a small bet size, so I'm getting really good pot odds. I could potentially call more here. So the most fun thing to me as you start to get better is that it goes from 1 dimension to 2 dimension to 3 dimensions, and you can start looking at a lot of different points that you can consider into a decision like, do I have enough equity to call a certain spot? As you get better, your ability to detect things that will change the incentives becomes more accurate, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very interesting to see how as you evolve in learning more things about poker, it just gives you it's kind of the nuances where it helps you to make better decisions. But like it's better to understand the first step and then the second step and then kind of build on that. Because if you don't understand the first and second step, there's no way you can reach the third step.
Right.
So I think there's one part of the our river explanation that I don't think we really touched on as well is when we are out of position and we are deciding whether to be we are going to be splitting our range between value bets bluffs and also the bluff catching where we check. So um, the reason I wanted to bring this up is that I think that when we are out of position, we need to be checking some of our strong hands sometimes as well. Otherwise, if we take this strategy again here, where we value bet this amount and we bluff this amount and we check all our bluff catches, then our strategy becomes very easy for our opponent to play against us. And every time we check, he knows that we have a bluff catcher. And um, in order to prevent him from playing too perfectly against us, sometimes we want to take some hands that are value and be checking them to kind of protect our checking range in some ways. To be honest, I'm not sure what's the best way to explain this concept that we need to split the range in this spot. So maybe you can give it a go and try.
Let's just start by saying this is what people talk about when they talk about slow playing a hand. A lot of people are doing it because they just think it's a good trap, but if you look at what it's doing structurally, it's protecting a range of mostly bluff catchers so that your opponent can't play perfectly against it. So yeah, it's kind of a trap when you have that super strong hand and you're checking it and you're being tricky. But if you look at it in the bigger picture, what's actually happening is you're choosing to protect the checking range with some really strong hands so that your opponent can't start playing too perfectly against you. Because if you didn't check some really strong hands, if Wayne is the player behind me and I check to him and he knows that I never have stronger than a middle pair hand, well, now that makes it very easy for him not to just maybe bet a strong top pair, but he can start betting even thinner for value. And that's not good for me because the more accurately Wayne can value bet, the less EV my range ends up having on the whole. I don't want to allow Wayne such clear vision over my range that he can start value betting perfectly against me. So slow playing is the tool that you can use to make it harder for your opponent to exploit you in that way. But in the beginning, when you first learn poker, people just more talk about it in terms of like trapping. And that is what it is. But there's a specific reason that you're doing that when you start to look at the game from a more theoretical lens, I guess. We could prove why it's important to trap sometimes. And I think that's a point that is kind of necessary to touch on, which we just did.
See. All right. So I guess do you have anything else to cover for this river topic?
I'm good on this. I like how we hit it from both the side of the aggressor and the defender, and I like how we switched the positions around too and discuss the difference between in and out. So in terms of giving a pretty well-rounded heuristic, I think I'm pretty satisfied with this. And do you want to do one more river next time, or are we going straight to the turn in the next one?
Well, I'd say that we can split things up and go straight to the turn next time.
Let's turn it over to them, though, and get some feedback. And if there are future questions from this episode, maybe we can just do a follow-up river in the comments and help some people out in that sense, and then go to turn next time.
All right, perfect. Yeah, it's fun, Nick.
Yeah, I had fun with this one. I like how it feels like we both were able to explain the part that the other person couldn't explain in this one. So I think it's a good combination.
All right. Catch you later.
Okay, guys. See you next time for turn play. Thanks, Wayne.